The House of Silence. The Kensington estate loomed in the twilight like a relic of another time. Pristine, grand, but utterly lifeless. Behind its wrought iron gates and manicured gardens stood a mansion that had long ceased to be a home. Inside, Elliot Kensington sat in his study, nursing a glass of aged whiskey as the evening light cast long shadows on the dark wood paneling. The fireplace crackled softly, the only sound breaking the overwhelming silence. His gaze drifted to the portrait above the mantel, a woman with warm brown eyes, her gentle smile frozen in time. Sarah. It had been 5 years since he lost her. 5 years of silence. 5 years of drowning in work, in wealth, in obligations that meant nothing. He took another sip of whiskey, ignoring the sharp pang in his chest. Grief had become a familiar presence, an old ghost that refused to leave. A sharp knock on the study door disrupted his thoughts. "Sir," came the voice of Leonard Smith, his ever-composed butler. "Miss Clark is here to see you." Elliot sighed, setting his glass down. Meredith Clark, his assistant, was one of the few people who still dared to disturb him after hours. "Let her in," he said, rubbing his temples. Moments later, Meredith stepped in, her sharp heels clicking against the polished floor. She carried a leather-bound folder, a look of hesitation flickering across her face. "I wouldn't normally bother you, but this requires your personal approval," she said, placing the folder on his desk. Elliot glanced at it and exhaled. He already knew what it was: the final approval documents for this year's Kensington Charity Gala, a legacy of Sarah's vision. It had started as a true humanitarian effort, a cause she had poured her heart into, but over the years it had become another high society networking event, a painful reminder of how far he had drifted from the man she had once loved. "Just handle it," he muttered, not bothering to open the folder. Meredith hesitated. "Sir, it's about the orphanage sponsorships." Elliot stiffened slightly. "What about them?" Meredith cleared her throat. "One of the orphanages on our list, St. Mary's, is in dire condition. They're requesting emergency funding. It used to be one of Sarah's top priorities before she—" Her voice trailed off, but the unspoken words lingered. "Before she died." Elliot remained silent, fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. "We can have the legal team draft the documents," Meredith continued, "but it would mean a personal visit, to assess the situation. A personal visit. To an orphanage. To a place filled with children." Elliot's gut twisted. He had spent years avoiding places like that. The thought of seeing those children, abandoned, parentless, forced him to confront the cruel randomness of loss. Why had Sarah been taken? Why were these children left alone? "I don't do personal visits," he said coolly, shifting his gaze back to the fire. Meredith sighed, but she didn't argue. Instead, she placed a single photograph on the desk before turning to leave. The moment she was gone, Elliot reluctantly glanced at the photo. It showed a group of smiling children in worn-out clothes, standing outside a crumbling brick building. In the center stood a little girl in a faded blue dress, her hair styled in neat braids, held together by matching ribbons. Elliot frowned. Something about the child's eyes, a soft, haunting brown, made his chest tighten. The gala night. 3 nights later, the Grand Kensington Charity Gala was in full swing. The ballroom shimmered with golden light, the chandeliers casting an ethereal glow over the sea of well-dressed guests. Wine flowed, politicians made empty promises, and money changed hands in the name of charity. Elliot moved through the crowd like a ghost, shaking hands, exchanging polite smiles, but feeling nothing. Then, near the silent auction table, something unexpected happened. A small tug at his sleeve. He turned sharply, only to find himself staring down at the very same little girl from the photograph. She stood before him, the same faded blue dress and braided hair, her eyes, Sarah's eyes, locked onto his. "You look lonely," she said softly. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. For a long moment, Elliot couldn't speak. The girl studied him curiously, seemingly unafraid of the towering, well-dressed strangers surrounding her. Amara, a nun in a traditional habit, hurried over, gently placing a hand on the little girl's shoulder. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Kensington. This is Amara. We're with Street Marys." Elliot barely heard her. His eyes had caught something else, something small, but utterly devastating. A necklace, a wooden pendant shaped like a star, hanging around Amara's neck. A chill ran through Elliot's spine. His wife had one just like it, and she had never taken it off. The walls of the ballroom seemed to close in, the music fading into a distant hum. What was this child doing with Sarah's necklace? His chest tightened. Who was she? And why did he suddenly feel as if his entire world was about to change? A ghost from the past. The necklace that shattered everything. Elliot stared at the wooden pendant, his heartbeat an erratic rhythm against his ribs. The polished surface of the star-shaped necklace glinted softly under the ballroom lights, a simple trinket that held the weight of a lifetime. His fingers itched to touch it, to confirm that it was real and not some cruel illusion. "Where did you get that?" His voice, usually smooth and commanding, came out raw and strained. Amara blinked up at him, her small fingers instinctively wrapping around the pendant as if protecting it. "It was my mommy's," she said softly. Elliot felt his blood run cold. A sharp breath behind him. Meredith Clark had stepped closer, her keen eyes flickering between Elliot and the child. She had seen it too. Before Elliot could speak again, the nun, Sister Catherine, placed a gentle but firm hand on Amara's shoulder, her worried gaze settling on him. "Mr. Kensington, I know this is unexpected, but perhaps we should speak privately," she suggested. Elliot took a moment to regain his composure, swallowing the storm raging inside him. He looked down at Amara again, who was still watching him with those unbearably familiar brown eyes. Sarah's eyes. "Yes," he said stiffly. "Let's talk. The hidden truths of Street Marys." 15 minutes later, Elliot found himself seated in a dimly lit antechamber near the gala's main hall. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and classical music felt distant, almost unreal. Across from him, Sister Catherine sat upright, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Beside her, Amara kicked her feet absent-mindedly, humming to herself. Meredith stood at Elliot's side, sensing that something profound was unfolding. "Tell me everything," Elliot said finally, his voice dangerously calm. "Who was her mother? And why is she wearing that necklace?" Sister Catherine hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Amara's mother was a woman named Lydia Grant. She passed away 5 years ago," she began gently. 5 years ago. The same time Sarah died." Elliot clenched his fists under the table. "She was one of the most selfless people I've ever met," the nun continued. "Lydia dedicated her life to helping others. She worked with struggling families, volunteered at shelters, and..." She trailed off, watching Elliot carefully. "She was part of your wife's charity initiative, Mr. Kensington." Elliot's breath caught. Meredith's eyes widened in silent realization. "That can't be," Elliot muttered, shaking his head. "I would have known. I never heard of her." "Because you weren't looking." The nun's words, though spoken softly, struck harder than any accusation. "Sarah and Lydia were close," she continued. "They worked side by side to help build the shelters your wife was so passionate about. Lydia even stayed on after Sarah." She hesitated, lowering her voice. "After she passed away." Elliot's world tilted. Sarah had always spoken about her work, the shelters, the family she helped, but he had never cared to learn the names. Now one of those names sat before him in the form of a 5-year-old girl. "And the necklace." His voice was hoarse. Sister Catherine sighed. "Lydia told me once that it was a gift from someone she loved, someone who changed her life." Elliot's pulse thundered. He knew that necklace. It was one of a kind. He had commissioned it himself years ago, for Sarah. Had Sarah given it away, or had it ended up with Lydia some other way? Amara fidgeted in her seat, growing restless with the conversation. With an innocent curiosity, she looked up at Elliot and asked, "Are you mad at me?" The question startled him. "No," he said quickly, shaking his head. "Why would I be?" Amara twirled a braid between her fingers, her small voice barely above a whisper. "Because when people look at me like that, they're usually mad." Elliot felt something deep inside him crack. How many times had this child been dismissed, overlooked, left behind? His throat tightened as he realized something undeniable. He was seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time, and he couldn't look away. A decision that changed everything. Later that night, Elliot sat alone in his study, the firelight casting flickering shadows across the walls. The glass of whiskey in his hand remained untouched. On the desk before him sat a photo of Amara, taken earlier that evening, and beside it, a faded picture of Sarah wearing the same necklace. His fingers brushed the wooden pendant he had retrieved from a long-forgotten drawer, a matching piece to the one Amara now carried. The weight of the past crashed down on him. Sarah had given away something precious. Asterisk, asterisk, a gift meant for her. Asterisk, asterisk, to another woman. To Lydia. And Lydia, in turn, had left it with her daughter. His mind reeled with unspoken questions, but only one thought burned clear. He couldn't walk away from this child. Elliot had spent 5 years running from his grief, from his past, from himself. But Amara, she was a part of Sarah's past, a living, breathing connection to everything he had lost, and perhaps a chance to finally make things right. Without hesitating, he reached for his phone. "Meredith," he said as soon as she answered, "I need you to start the adoption process." A stunned silence followed. Adoption. Elliot stared at the flickering flames. "I'm bringing Amara home." Meredith didn't reply for several moments. When she did, her voice was unusually gentle. "Are you sure?" Elliot closed his eyes. For the first time in 5 years he was. A child in the house of ghosts. The weight of a decision. The Kensington mansion, once a place of hollow grandeur, was about to welcome an unfamiliar presence. For 5 years, its halls had known nothing but silence, a vast, echoing stillness broken only by the footsteps of the staff and the distant hum of the city beyond its gates. Now that silence was about to be shattered. Elliot Kensington sat in his study, his fingers tracing the rim of a glass of untouched whiskey. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows against the towering bookshelves that lined the walls. He had spent the better part of the night sitting there, questioning everything. He had made the call. The paperwork was in motion. By tomorrow evening, Amara would be living in his house, and he had no idea how to be a father. A deep exhale left him as he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. "What am I doing?" The sound of a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in." The door opened, and Meredith Clark stepped inside, clutching a tablet and a thick stack of papers. Her expression was unreadable. "Everything is in place," she said smoothly, setting the documents down in front of him. "The adoption process is starting, but since Amara is already a ward of the state, the emergency guardianship has been granted immediately." Elliot nodded stiffly. "And the mansion?" Meredith sighed. "Leonard is overseeing the preparations. Alicia has taken the liberty of ordering new clothes and furniture for Amara's room. The guest room by the library is being converted." A faint smirk tugged at the corner of Elliot's lips. "You seem oddly prepared for this." Meredith shot him a knowing look. "Because I knew you'd do this before you did." Elliot's expression darkened. "I don't even know why I'm doing this." Meredith raised an eyebrow. "Yes, you do." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. They both knew he couldn't walk away from this. Not from the necklace. Not from Sarah's past. And certainly not from Amara. Elliot exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "And what if I mess this up?" Meredith's lips curved into a rare, genuine smile. "Then at least you'll have tried." The arrival. The black limousine rolled through the iron gates, the massive Kensington mansion looming ahead like something out of a fairy tale. Amara sat in the back seat, her small hands gripping the worn stuffed bunny she had brought with her. Her wide eyes darted between the enormous pillars, the stained glass windows, and the immaculately trimmed hedges that lined the driveway. To a child used to cramped orphanage dormitories, peeling paint, and flickering light bulbs, this place might as well have been a palace. Elliot sat beside her, silent. He wasn't sure what to say. For a man who had spent his entire life in control, this moment felt terrifyingly uncertain. As the car came to a halt, Leonard Smith, his butler, stepped forward, his expression as stoic as ever. Beside him stood Alicia Rice, the head housekeeper, who was noticeably nervous. "Welcome, Miss Amara," Leonard said smoothly, offering a slight bow. Amara hesitated, looking between the two unfamiliar faces, then turned to Elliot. "Do I have to call them sir and ma'am?" Elliot blinked. "What?" "At the orphanage, we have to call everyone that." Leonard stiffened ever so slightly before clearing his throat. "Here, you may simply call us Leonard and Alicia, if that is more comfortable for you." Amara beamed. "Okay." Alicia visibly relaxed. "Come, sweetheart," she said, motioning toward the house. "Let's show you to your room." Amara hesitated for a fraction of a second before reaching for Alicia's hand, allowing herself to be led inside. Elliot exhaled, watching her small frame disappear through the massive double doors. Leonard turned to him. "Are you certain about this, sir?" Elliot's jaw clenched. "No." A rare flicker of amusement passed through Leonard's eyes before he followed after Alicia. Elliot Kensington had never felt more unprepared in his life. The room that wasn't hers, the guest room by the library, had been transformed. What was once an impersonal, rarely used space was now a child's sanctuary. Soft pastel walls, shelves filled with books, stuffed animals neatly arranged on a white bedspread. Amara stood in the doorway, silent. Alicia hesitated. "If you don't like it, we can." "It's too neat," Amara said suddenly. Alicia blinked. I don't want to mess it up." For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, Alicia knelt beside her. "Sweetheart, this is your room now. You're supposed to make it messy." Amara's lip trembled. She took a small step forward, then another, and slowly, hesitantly, climbed onto the bed. Her small fingers ran over the soft pillows, the stuffed animals, the neatly folded blanket at the edge of the mattress. Finally, she picked up one of the plush bears and hugged it tightly. Elliot watched from the doorway, unseen. Something in his chest tightened. This child had never had anything that was truly hers. Not until now. The ghost of Sarah Kensington. That night, after the household had gone to bed, Elliot found himself standing in front of Sarah's portrait. The familiar ache crept in, unwelcome but unavoidable. "Who was she to you?" he asked aloud, though no one was there to answer. Sarah had always been the compassionate one. She had spent her nights volunteering, pouring her heart into helping people he had dismissed as unimportant. Now one of those people's children was sleeping upstairs in his house, wearing Sarah's necklace. He ran a hand through his hair, turning away. As he did, he spotted something he hadn't noticed before, a dust-covered photo album tucked away on one of the bookshelves. Slowly, he pulled it out. The cover was worn leather, the edges softened by time. Elliot opened it and froze. The very first picture inside was of Sarah and Lydia. They stood together outside an old community center, smiling, arms wrapped around each other. Sarah had written in her familiar delicate script below the photo, "Hope is meant to be shared." Elliot's throat closed. His wife had loved Lydia, trusted her, and somehow fate had placed Lydia's child into his care. His fingers curled around the edge of the album. He had spent 5 years ignoring his wife's legacy. Now, it was living in his house, sleeping under his roof, and Elliot had a feeling that his carefully controlled world was about to change forever. the cracks in the fortress, the sound of small footsteps. The Kensington mansion had always been a place of order. Every surface polished, every step measured, every conversation brief and controlled. But now, there was a child. And children brought chaos. Elliot Kensington had never thought much about what a child's presence would mean in his home. He had never needed to. Until now. Until Amara. Now the once silent halls carried the soft thud of small feet against polished marble. Now the library smelled faintly of crayons and glue. Now his spotless office had tiny fingerprints on the windows. Now there was laughter in his house. A morning unlike any other. Elliot sat at the long dining table, a newspaper in hand, his coffee steaming beside him. As usual, Leonard stood near the entrance, poised and proper. Everything seemed normal. Until... bang! The kitchen doors burst open, and Amara sprinted into the room. Barefoot, holding a stuffed rabbit upside down, wearing a crown made of pipe cleaners. Alicia followed behind her, looking slightly panicked but not at all surprised. "Amara, sweetheart." "Mr. Kensington," Amara interrupted loudly, skidding to a halt beside his chair. "Did you know you have a secret room?" Elliot lowered the newspaper. His brow lifted. "A secret room." Amara nodded enthusiastically. "It's in the library, behind the big bookshelf. I was playing hide and seek, and I found it. It has dust and old books, and a really big chair that looks like a throne." Leonard's eyebrows twitched. "That would be the old reading nook, sir. Mrs. Kensington's private collection used to be kept there." Elliot's stomach twisted. Sarah's favorite place in the house. Amara had found it without even trying. "I want to make it my clubhouse," Amara declared proudly. "Can I? Please?" Elliot stared at her. Something in him said no. That was Sarah's space. Untouched, unchanged, preserved. But then he saw the hope in Amara's eyes, and something in him cracked. "Fine," he said gruffly, "but you'll have to dust it yourself." Amara gasped in delight. "Deal." And with that, she bolted from the room, shouting about needing a feather duster. Elliot sighed. Leonard cleared his throat. "Shall I prepare the will, sir? It seems you've already lost the house." Elliot glared. Alicia smirked. A heart that had been locked away. Later that afternoon, Elliot stood in the once-forgotten reading nook. Dust motes danced in the air as sunlight streamed through the arched window. He ran a hand over the old mahogany desk, fingers tracing the imprints of memories long buried. Sarah had spent countless hours here, reading, dreaming, planning a future he had ignored. Now, it was going to belong to a 5-year-old girl who still believed in fairy tales. Elliot wasn't sure how he felt about that. Lessons in fatherhood. It turned out that being responsible for a child required more than just signing legal documents. It required answers to a million questions. Why do you have so many books if you don't read them? What does aristocrat mean? Why do rich people drink tiny cups of coffee? Do you think the moon gets lonely? Why do adults say they're fine when they're not? Were you lonely before I came here? Elliot had expected messy rooms. He had not expected messy emotions. And he definitely had not expected to be terrible at answering questions. The first nightmare. The first time it happened, he didn't even hear her at first. It was well past midnight, and Elliot had just finished reading over a business proposal. He was about to switch off the lights when he heard it. A small, broken whimper. Faint, barely audible. Elliot frowned. Then came another. His stomach tightened. He followed the sound. When he reached Amara's room, the door was slightly ajar. Inside, he saw her, curled up in a tight ball, her tiny fingers gripping the bedsheets. She was still asleep, but her face was twisted in fear. "No," she whimpered softly, shaking her head against the pillow. "Please don't leave me." Something in Elliot fractured. He wasn't sure what possessed him to do it, but he stepped into the room and knelt beside the bed. "Amara," he said quietly. She twitched. Her breathing hitched. "Amara." He tried again, a little softer. This time, her eyes fluttered open. And for a split second, she looked terrified. Then recognition. Then relief. Then, without warning, she threw herself at him. Small arms wrapped around his neck, clinging. Elliot froze. He had never been held like this before. Not like this. Not by someone who simply needed him. "You were gone," Amara mumbled against his shoulder. "In my dream, you were gone." Elliot's throat tightened. He wasn't sure what to do. So he did the only thing that made sense. He placed a steadying hand on her back. "I'm still here," he said quietly. Amara gripped him tighter. And just like that, Elliot Kensington, the man who had spent 5 years drowning in solitude, was needed by someone again. The first threat. The next morning, Elliot received a message. It was delivered by courier, hand-addressed, with no return sender. Inside was a single slip of paper, written in jagged, uneven letters. "I know who she is. You don't deserve her. I'm coming to take her back." The air in the study turned to ice. Elliot read the words again, and again, and again. A slow, burning rage spread through his chest. His grip tightened on the letter. Someone was trying to take her. His child. Elliot Kensington had spent his life building empires, winning battles, and amassing power. But this was not business. This was personal. And no one was taking Amara from him. Not now. Not ever. The storm begins. The letter that changed everything. Elliot stared at the letter in his hands, his grip tightening. The ink on the page was uneven, as if written in haste. The words dripped with menace. "I know who she is. You don't deserve her. I'm coming to take her back." A slow, simmering rage boiled in his veins. Who? Who would claim Amara like this? Who thought they had the right to take her? And why now? His mind ran through possibilities, but only one name surfaced. Jonathan Pierce, the man from the shadows. Jonathan Pierce, a con artist, a ghost, a man with nothing to lose. Bernard King, Elliot's private investigator, had dug up just enough to confirm the worst. Amara's biological father was a man who had spent his life taking from others, a criminal who had disappeared years ago, vanishing after Lydia Grant's death. But now he was back, and he wanted Amara. Elliot's jaw clenched as he slammed the letter onto his desk. Not a chance. A silent war begins. Elliot wasted no time. Leonard, the butler, appeared almost immediately, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Sir." Elliot held up the letter. "Tighten security. No one gets past the gates unless I say so." "Understood." Leonard's jaw tightened. "Understood, sir." And Meredith. A knock at the door. Meredith Clark stepped in, already knowing something was wrong. "What happened?" Elliot handed her the letter. She read it. Her face paled. "Who do we think sent this?" Elliot's voice was low, controlled. "Pierce." Meredith inhaled sharply. "So he's finally making a move." "He won't take her," Elliot said firmly. Meredith studied his face, then nodded. "What's the plan?" Elliot exhaled. "We fight." Meanwhile, upstairs, Amara knew something was wrong. She was only 5, but she wasn't stupid. Adults thought kids didn't notice things, but she did. She noticed how Mr. Kensington was different today. She noticed how the people in the house whispered in the hallways. She noticed how Leonard locked all the doors, even during the day. Something was happening, and no one was telling her. That's when she decided she would find out herself. The forbidden room. Amara knew that Mr. Kensington had a secret room. It was the one place in the house she wasn't allowed. The big study with the locked door, which meant it must hold secrets. She waited until nightfall. Then she slipped out of bed, tiptoed down the hallway, and crept toward the forbidden room. Her little fingers tried the handle. Locked. She bit her lip. She had seen Leonard use a key earlier. Where did he keep it? She scanned the hallway, then her eyes landed on the cabinet by the staircase. She had seen Leonard put things in there before. Carefully, she padded over to it, stood on her tiptoes, and eased open the drawer. Inside, among neatly arranged documents, was a ring of keys. She grabbed them, heart racing. Then she went back to the study. She tried one key. Didn't fit. Another. Didn't fit. A third. Click. The door swung open. The secrets of Elliot Kensington. Amara stepped into the room. It smelled like leather, whiskey, and something old. The fire in the corner had burned down, leaving only glowing embers. She swallowed and looked around. Then she saw it. A photo album sitting on the massive desk. Her name was on the cover. Her heart pounded. Carefully, she pulled the book toward her and flipped it open. The first picture. Her mother. Her real mother. Laughing. Standing next to a beautiful woman with warm brown eyes. Amara's breath hitched. It was the same woman from the portrait in the grand hall. Mr. Kensington's wife. Her little hands tightened on the page. Why was her mother in this book? And what did it mean? Elliot finds out. The study door creaked. Elliot's voice came instantly. Amara. She froze. She turned slowly, her heart pounding. Elliot stood in the doorway, his gaze falling immediately on the open album. His entire body stiffened. Where did you get that? His voice was quiet. Too quiet. Amara felt small. She gripped the book tighter. Her voice failed her. Elliot exhaled sharply, running a hand down his face. Then, after a long pause, he softened. He walked over, knelt beside her, and gently closed the book. You weren't supposed to see this yet. Amara swallowed. Why? Elliot looked at her for a long moment. Then, finally, because it's the truth, and the truth is messy. Amara frowned. She looked back at the photo album. Then, softly, she asked the question that had been burning in her little heart for days. Did you know my mommy? Elliot closed his eyes. Then, finally, he nodded. Yes, Amara. I knew her. And I know things about her that you don't. Her little hands tightened into fists. She wanted to ask more. She wanted to demand answers. But deep down, she already knew. Mr. Kensington and her mommy were connected. And that changed everything. The war was just beginning. That night, Elliot didn't sleep. He sat in his study, the letter from Pierce crumpled in his hand. He had wanted to protect Amara from the truth. But now, the truth wasn't waiting for him anymore. Now, the truth was coming for them. And Elliot Kensington would not lose. Not to Pierce. Not to the past. Not this time. He looked at the fire, jaw clenched. Then he made a decision. Bernard, he said into his phone, I want everything on Pierce, every weakness, every secret, every mistake, and I want it now. If Jonathan Pierce wanted a fight, he just started a war. The battle for Amara. A man with nothing to lose. The city skyline stretched beyond the vast windows of Elliot Kensington's office, but he wasn't admiring the view. His fingers tapped against the mahogany desk, his sharp gaze locked onto Bernard King, the private investigator seated across from him. A manila folder sat between them, its contents spilling onto the desk, surveillance photos, police records, court transcripts. The sins of Jonathan Pierce. Tell me, Elliot said, his voice a controlled growl. Bernard exhaled, rubbing his temples. It's worse than we thought. Elliot's jaw tightened. Fraud. Extortion. Multiple counts of domestic disturbances. He never stayed in one place long enough to face charges, but his record is a disaster. Elliot stared at the photos. Grainy images of a man with hollow eyes, darting glances over his shoulder. a man who had lived on the fringes of the law, scraping by on manipulation and desperation. And now he wants Amara, Elliot muttered. Not because he cares about her, but because he thinks he can use her to get to me. Bernard nodded grimly. That's exactly it. He's broke. He's desperate. And he knows the world is watching you right now. Which means he'll come at me with everything he has, Elliot said. Bernard hesitated. There's something else. Elliot's sharp eyes flickered up. He's already filed a custody claim. For a long moment, silence hung in the air like a loaded gun. Then, crack! Elliot's fist slammed against the desk, rattling the contents of the folder. That son of a... He stopped himself, breathing heavily. Bernard leaned forward. This isn't just about money anymore, Elliot. If Pierce makes this public, it becomes a media circus. The courts prefer biological parents, even bad ones. If he plays this right, he could drag this out for months. Years. Elliot's blood ran cold. Months. Years. Could Amara survive that? Could he? No. This had to end before it even began. He leaned forward, his voice a quiet command. What's his weak spot? Bernard hesitated. Then, slowly, he pulled out another photograph. It was taken from a security camera, time-stamped 3 nights ago. Jonathan Pierce, arguing with a man outside a rundown bar. The exchange looked heated, angry gestures, desperate body language. Elliot narrowed his eyes. Who's the other guy? Bernard sighed. Loan shark. Goes by the name Deacon Price. Pierce owes him a small fortune. And if he doesn't pay up soon. He didn't have to finish the sentence. Elliot leaned back, running a hand through his hair. Jonathan Pierce was a cornered animal. And cornered animals made reckless choices, which meant Amara was in more danger than ever. An unbreakable promise. Elliot returned to the mansion that evening, his mind a battlefield of strategy and emotions. He found Amara in the library, curled up in the oversized armchair, flipping through a book far too big for her small hands. The moment she saw him, she brightened. Mr. Kensington. Elliot exhaled. How had she managed to worm her way into his heart so fast? What are you reading? He asked, sitting beside her. She held up the book proudly. Greek mythology. Did you know there's a guy named Atlas who has to hold up the whole sky forever? Elliot smirked. Sounds exhausting. Amara nodded seriously. I think it's 'cause he made the gods mad. And what lesson does that teach us? Amara tapped her chin thoughtfully. Don't make powerful people mad. Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. Or maybe, don't take on burdens you don't have to. She looked up at him with those big, knowing eyes. Like you. Elliot stiffened. What do you mean? Amara tilted her head. You always look like you're holding something heavy. Elliot opened his mouth. Closed it. How did she see right through him? She shifted, fidgeting with the wooden pendant around her neck. Sarah's necklace. The weight of it crushed him. I promise, he said suddenly, his voice low and fierce. No one is ever going to take you away from me. Amara blinked. Why? Elliot inhaled sharply. He could have said 1,000 things. Because you remind me of someone I lost. Because I've been a coward for too long. Because you are the first thing in years that has made me feel alive. But instead, because you're mine now. Amara's small fingers tightened around his hand, and that was that. The custody battle begins. 2 days later, Elliot sat in a high-rise law office across from George Thompson, his longtime attorney. Pierce is coming after her, Elliot said. And we have to make sure he loses. George exhaled, adjusting his glasses. We need to be strategic. Courts favor biological parents unless they can be proven unfit. Elliot slid the folder across the desk. George opened it. His eyebrows lifted. Fraud. Loan debts. Multiple evictions. An active warrant. Elliot's voice was cold. We don't have to prove he's a bad father. We just have to prove he's never been one at all. George nodded. We can use this, but we need more. We need people to testify. Elliot exhaled. Sister Catherine, Meredith, the orphanage staff. George scribbled notes. And we need to prepare Amara. Elliot froze. Amara. She didn't know about any of this. How the hell was he supposed to explain to a 5-year-old that someone was trying to take her away? He clenched his jaw. I'll handle it. George gave him a long look. Elliot, you know what this means, don't you? Elliot sighed. Yeah, this isn't just about proving I'm the better option. This is about making sure he can't touch her. Ever. George nodded. Then let's make sure we win. The enemy moves. That night, Elliot returned home late. As he stepped into the grand foyer, something felt off. The staff was tense. Leonard stood stiffly near the staircase. Alicia looked like she had been crying. Elliot's chest tightened. What happened? Leonard hesitated. There was an incident, sir. Elliot's blood ran cold. Where's Amara? She's safe, Leonard assured quickly. But someone came to the gates. Elliot's hands curled into fists. Who? Alicia whispered the name. Jonathan Pierce. Rage exploded in Elliot's chest. What did he say? Leonard's voice was quiet. He asked for his daughter. Elliot's vision darkened. He said he'd be back. Elliot turned on his heel and stormed toward his study. He picked up his phone. Dialed Bernard. The investigator answered on the first ring. Find him, Elliot growled. Find him now. If Jonathan Pierce thought he could just walk into Elliot Kensington's world and take what belonged to him, he had another thing coming. The reckoning. A war on two fronts. Elliot Kensington had won 1,000 battles in his lifetime. Boardroom wars, corporate takeovers, legal disputes. But this was personal. This was about Amara. And Jonathan Pierce was a man with nothing to lose. The enemy in the shadows. Pierce had made his move. The gates of the Kensington mansion had held firm, but the message was clear. I'm coming for her. Elliot wasn't going to wait for that to happen. He had spent his life playing defense, shutting himself off, keeping the world at a distance. But now he was going on the attack. Bernard, he said into the phone, his voice a blade of ice. I want him found tonight. The investigator's voice was steady. We already found him. Elliot stiffened. Where? A pause. Then, at the courthouse. The legal ambush. When Elliot arrived at the downtown courthouse, the air was thick with tension. The grand marble steps felt heavier beneath his feet. Inside, the halls were eerily silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of the antique clock on the wall. And at the far end of the corridor, Jonathan Pierce stood waiting. Elliot Kensington had spent his entire life surrounded by powerful men. But Jonathan Pierce wasn't powerful. He was desperate. His suit was cheap, his shoulders tense, his eyes darting like a trapped animal. But his smirk, that was the smirk of a man who thought he had won. Kensington, he drawled. You look tense. Elliot's jaw tightened. What are you doing here, Pierce? Pierce tapped the envelope in his hands. Filing for custody, same as you. Elliot inhaled slowly, his pulse controlled, but his fury rising like a tide. You don't stand a chance. Pierce shrugged. Maybe. But judges like biological parents, and public sympathy, that's a hell of a weapon. Elliot's gaze darkened. You don't want custody. You want leverage. Pierce's smirk widened. You're damn right I do. You think I'll buy you off. A laugh. You already have. You just don't know it yet. Elliot's fingers curled into fists. He had one rule in business: never negotiate with thieves. And Jonathan Pierce was the worst kind of thief. He didn't steal money. He stole futures. And he wasn't going to steal Amara's. Not while Elliot Kensington drew breath. A father's fury. The next morning, Meredith Clark stormed into Elliot's office, slamming a stack of legal documents onto his desk. "We have a problem." Elliot exhaled sharply. "Tell me." Meredith's voice was tight with fury. "Pierce is playing dirty. He went to the media." Elliot's stomach hardened like stone. She flipped on the television. A news anchor's voice filled the room. "A shocking custody battle is unfolding between billionaire Elliot Kensington and struggling father Jonathan Pierce, who is fighting to reclaim his daughter from a life of cold luxury." Elliot's teeth clenched. The footage cut to Pierce, sitting in some dingy apartment, putting on the performance of his life. "All I want is my little girl back," Pierce said, his voice shaking just enough to sound broken. "I made mistakes, but I love my daughter. Money can't replace family." Meredith clicked the TV off. Silence. Then, "We need to fight back," she said. "Now." Elliot stared at the blank screen, his pulse a quiet thunder. Then, slowly, he stood. "Get George Thompson." Meredith nodded. "And the press." Elliot's voice was iron. "Let them come." The custody hearing. The courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the back rows. The Kensington legal team sat at the right table. And on the left, Jonathan Pierce, his lawyer, and his lies. The judge, a stern woman with sharp eyes, folded her hands. "Let's begin." Pierce's lawyer, Franklin Ward, was the first to speak. "Your Honor, my client is a man trying to rebuild his life, a man who has been unjustly stripped of his parental rights." Elliot's jaw tightened. Ward gestured dramatically. "Mr. Kensington, on the other hand, is a man of wealth and power, but does he understand what it means to be a father? To truly care for a child beyond financial support?" Elliot's hands tightened into fists beneath the table. Then, it was George Thompson's turn. The seasoned attorney stood smoothly. "Your Honor, let's examine the facts. My client has provided stability, security, and most importantly, love. He has given this child a home, a future. Mr. Pierce, on the other hand, he slid a file onto the judge's desk. He has given her nothing." The judge flipped through the evidence. The evictions, the debts, the arrests. Pierce's expression twitched. But George wasn't done. He turned to the jury. "Amara is not a prize to be won. She is a child. And she deserves more than a father who only came back when it was convenient." Elliot looked at Pierce then. And for the first time, he saw fear in the man's eyes. He was losing. And he knew it. The final blow. Then, a surprise witness. The doors to the courtroom opened. Sister Catherine stepped inside. The audience whispered. The nun walked to the stand, her voice calm, steady. "I knew Amara's mother," she said. "I knew Lydia Grant, and I know that if she were alive today, she would want her daughter to stay with Elliot Kensington." The judge leaned forward. "Why?" Sister Catherine's gaze never wavered. "Because he is the man her mother trusted. He is the man who has done what Jonathan Pierce never did." He stayed. Pierce stiffened. The judge turned to him. "Mr. Pierce, do you have any further evidence?" Pierce hesitated. Then, slowly, he shook his head. The judge turned to Elliot. Then to Amara, who sat quietly in the front row, watching with wide eyes. Finally, the gavel fell. Custody is granted to Elliot Kensington. The end of the war. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters swarmed. But Elliot didn't stop. He walked through them, his steps unshaken. And at the bottom of the courthouse steps, Amara waited. She looked up at him, uncertain. "What does this mean?" she asked softly. Elliot knelt. "It means you're home." Amara's lip quivered. Then she launched herself into his arms. He caught her, held her, and for the first time in 5 years, Elliot Kensington felt whole. A home at last. 6 months later, the Kensington mansion was no longer a house of ghosts. It was a home. Laughter echoed through its halls. Footsteps. Asterisk, asterisk, small, hurried ones. Asterisk, asterisk, raced across the grand marble floors. The scent of warm cookies drifted from the kitchen, where Alicia and Amara were engaged in what could only be described as a baking war. No, no, you can't put that much chocolate in the batter. Alicia scolded playfully. Amara giggled. Why not? Because then it's not cookies, it's just melted chocolate. Elliot stood in the doorway, watching. Once, this house had been silent. Now, it was alive. The final conversation. That night, Elliot and Amara sat on the balcony, looking out over the city. She leaned against him, her tiny fingers fidgeting with the wooden star necklace. The last piece of Sarah Kensington. Do you miss her? Amara asked softly. Elliot exhaled. He didn't answer right away. Then, finally, I do, but I think she would be happy. Amara looked up at him. Because of me? Elliot smiled, brushing a stray braid from her face. Because of us. A father at last. As the city lights twinkled below, Elliot realized something. For 5 years, he had been running. From his grief. From his past. From feeling anything at all. But Amara had changed that. She had torn down his walls, piece by piece, without even trying. And now she was his daughter. And he was her father.